Are we on? Oh no, here we are.
Hello, hello.
Hello, hello. There we go. Okay, hi everyone. Well, you're completely dark, which is slightly intimidating, but hopefully you're out there. So for anyone who hasn't been at previous events, I'm Charlie Phillips. I'm one of the programmers at the inaugural Folkestone Documentary Festival. And we are incredibly excited to be doing this masterclass with Orlando von Einsiedel from Grain Media. A round of applause for Orlando, first of all. So for those of you who don't know, Orlando is an Oscar and BAFTA winning director and producer, and his company Grain has won over 100 international film awards. I'm just going to quote from the Grain website on their mission, because I think it's really inspiring. Grain is not defined by the type of film we make, but by the way we approach storytelling and the purposeful stories we tell. We focus on inspiring narratives of humble heroism from around the world, following extraordinary characters whose intimate stories speak to macro issues. And there's lots more to say about Orlando and Grain beyond that. But I think it's safe to say that Orlando is both one of the most exciting directors and producers working, but also one of the nicest people in the industry. Yeah, just embarrass you to start with. So I think what we're going to do sort of for the next just under an hour is we're going to walk through Orlando's career a little bit and show some trailers from the work that he's been involved in. And we'll make sure that we leave a bit of time at the end for you to ask any questions, and we'll turn the lights up so we can actually see you. But maybe the first thing we could do, Orlando, is could you just tell us a bit about your start in the industry? So yeah, how you took your first sort of footsteps towards the massive success that you are today.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. I am very embarrassed, and it's lovely to be here. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Okay, I have a slightly strange route into filmmaking. I was a professional snowboarder in my late teens, and the thing about snowboarding or skateboarding or those sorts of sports, the way you make money, and I'm talking a tiny bit of money. The way you make money is you get sponsored by a clothing brand, and then you get a little bit of extra money every time you're in a video or a magazine. And so what that did is it sort of created this incentive for me and all my sort of colleagues and friends in the snowboard world. Is it made an incentive to film each other and take photographs, so we'd all be in magazines and get an extra £10 for a picture. And basically I learned the craft of quite rudimentary filmmaking, but I learned the craft of filmmaking through making snowboard films. And I guess I got to a point where I knew there was a world outside of ski resorts, and I wanted to make films about things I cared about. But the fact that I knew how to film and had a basic understanding of editing, that helped transition into making documentaries. And I started actually, which was quite strange. I went from doing these snowboard films to doing these very sort of hardcore journalistic investigations, and doing a lot. Al Jazeera English actually just launched at the time, and I think they were looking for people that would pitch to them, and I did that, and these films would generally, something very bad was happening in the world. I had an understanding of journalism too, because I'd written quite a bit, and something very bad was happening, and we'd go out and we'd do an investigation, and you'd try and bring somebody to account for whatever that terrible thing was. And we made films about the trafficking of child footballers and pollution of a ginormous lake in Ethiopia, and the role of chocolate in the conflict in Ivory Coast. What was interesting is while making these films, I'd often come across really inspiring stories, and I'd think I'd never heard like a good news. I very rarely hear good news stories from West Africa or the Middle East, and I always thought these are the stories I'd be more interested in trying to tell. And one day I picked up a newspaper, and there was a story about a skateboard school in Kabul. And for me, it was like, wow, here's a story. I was a skateboarder as well as a snowboarder, so it's like, wow, that's amazing. And it was much more in the sort of territory that I was working in. And I thought this is a really lovely story. And the story was this school, skateboarding was part of it, but really it was about giving street kids an education they sort of got the street kids into this centre by saying you can skateboard, and then they taught them different things. And we cobbled together a little bit of money, and me and a cinematographer went out and we shot this film that was about 10 minutes long, called Skaterstan, To Live and Skate Kabul. And we just put it up on Vimeo, and in 24 hours it went viral. And it was like a light bulb went off, because I thought, well, maybe I'm not the only one that wants to hear sort of positive stories.
Was this the mid-2000s?
This was 2010.
Yeah, okay, cool.
And actually that, sorry, it's a long answer, but it sort of set a bit of a foundation for how the kind of stories that I was interested in and thought maybe other people might like to watch.
Yeah, amazing. And I think it was probably when you were doing a Skaterstan that I first became aware of you. Suddenly your name was everywhere. And so then Virunga came along, which I think it's fair to say was your first sort of big hit. Well, I suppose Skaterstan went viral, but Virunga was kind of interstellar. Should we see the trailer for Virunga, maybe? Can we run the trailer for Virunga, please?
Le parc national de Virunga, c'est la vie de la communauté.
C'est dans cette entité là où vous pouvez encore trouver les gorilles des montagnes. C'est ça ma vie. Ils ont l'amour.
I think that we have a problem.
Companies are exploring for oil. I came here to cover the security situation.
I was sworn in to ensure that Virunga National Park's protected. Oil companies have a reputation for controversial ventures. All their efforts are focused on the national park.
In the past, it has brought a lot of violence here. Everyone wants their slice of the cake.
This isn't a war yet, but it could be soon.
Companies are playing with fire.
Fear has driven people out of these villages.
If we leave, we would lose everything.
The national park is the only hope this region has.
You must justify why you are on this earth.
Finalement, nous serons aussi jugés. Nous allons seulement croiser le bras quand le parc sera en train de disparaître.
Pourtant, notre souhait est que ce parc reste immortel.
Right. Yeah, it's really amazing seeing that material. Where did this come from? What were the origins of Virunga?
So Virunga began. I find a lot of stories just by picking up a newspaper. There was an article about the Virunga National Park. I'd never heard of this place before, and it was an article in the Daily Mail of all things. But it was about the rangers of this park trying to rebuild it after 20 years of war, and I found it really inspiring. It was also because I'd never heard of this place. It was a bit like Jurassic Park. There was these volcanoes with lava lakes. There was mountain gorillas, and I thought that sounds like a really positive story from Congo, which is a place that's just only ever in the news for all the wrong reasons. And I remember writing to the park for a long time saying, I think what you're doing is incredible. Can I come and make a film? And they just ignored me for a long time. But eventually they got sick of me. I think that's one of the things about documentaries is gaining that access and that trust. It's a slow process. But eventually they said, okay, come out. And I'd been there about 2 weeks, and I remember the Rangers said, I told them about the film that I thought I wanted to try and tell. And they said, yes, Orlando, that's very interesting. But the story here that you should be telling is a story about an oil company from your country. And this oil company's here, and it's exploring for oil illegally, and it threatens everything that we've spent our lives trying to do. And so the story took this big U-turn very quickly and became something very different, and as you saw in the trailer.
And how long were you filming it for? What was the complete production timeline?
So Virunga took, I think it was 2 years. I lived there in the park for a year. I'd sort of do a month. I'd spend a month there, and then I'd come home and secure the material, the footage, and we'd do a little bit of editing and look at it. We lived in a tent on the top of this beautiful sort of mountain. And yeah, so 2 years.
Right. And at this point you were still sort of, I suppose, like relatively inexperienced in terms of a documentary of this size. So were you funded to do that, or were you just kind of doing it out on a limb?
So I was massively inexperienced. I realised very early on that we'd all bitten off way more than we could chew. We got a little bit of money at the very beginning to fund a few trips, but really, we applied to everybody. But the difficulty with applying for money for this film is we couldn't tell anyone about the investigative side of it, because it was there's too many people's lives at stake, and so we were applying for a film really about gorillas. And I think people, when we wrote the pictures, it just felt a bit one-dimensional. So almost everybody turned us down until we went to an organisation they were called BritDoc at the time, but they're called Doc Society now, and we opened up a little bit more about what the film was really about, and they kind of came on board, and they started to pair us up with more experienced people that could help with the legals, and Joanna Natasagara, who came on board as a producer, and all these other people that brought skills that frankly I didn't have.
And was that something that you really kind of welcomed at the time? Because I think you've always been about collaboration, and but I think like on this in particular, was that something that you like welcomed? Because some people would be threatened by that, would feel like their film was being taken away from them.
There was making Virunga was so unbelievably stressful, and there was a bit. As we were making it, it became clear that the film itself could be used as a tool to actually help protect the park. And because we were doing this, there was a long-term undercover investigation documenting evidence of this oil company and its behaviour, and knowing the expectation on the film to sort of be used to expose what was happening, that was an enormous amount of pressure. And that's aside from trying to make a good film. And so actually having other people that were way more knowledgeable, it started to feel like a massive amount of relief. So yes, it was good.
Yeah, and I suppose with this and with the White Helmets and other things you've done, you've sometimes been making films that would piss off powerful people and could potentially get you into trouble. And at a sort of relatively young age, when you were making Virunga, was that something you worried about, or was it, did you just carry on doing it and hope for the best?
Well, it's a very good question. I probably was naive, to be honest. But I think when you're so, this film and White Helmets, like Charlie mentioned, they were films that all of us working on them felt so deeply passionate about. The risks to us felt small compared to the risks that everyone that we were working with on the ground were taking. The risks to us were tiny in comparison, and therefore they felt manageable, and frankly just acceptable. I remember when me and Joanna were sent a sort of 20-page legal document from this oil company's solicitors, basically saying, if you don't pull this film, and they wrote to all of the film festivals that we were going to launch at, and said, look, you need to pull this film, or you could face legal action. I remember that was the consequences of that are quite scary, because it's we're going to sue you for millions and millions of dollars of damages. But you know, at the end of the day, that's just money, and what everyone, the risks that everyone in Virunga, all the rangers, what they were taking every day were you know, these were risks to their lives, to their families' lives, extraordinary risks.
Yeah. And this ended up going out on Netflix, and this was the first time that you worked with Netflix. So you've worked with a few times since. How did that come about?
So, so we you know, we had these. You made this film. I don't know if there's other filmmakers here. You make a film. You have grand ambitions, but really you need an audience. And so we'd launched the film on the festival circuit, and we were taking it out to, we were talking to different sales agents to try and find a distributor. And this was 2013, and it was it was really depressing, because everyone was coming back to us saying, well, you know, most of it's in, you know, French or Swahili. It hasn't really got that bigger an audience opportunity, and you know, and frankly, a lot of networks or distributors, they also look at the money that it can make, and if it's not going to make money in the cinemas, they weren't that interested. And so we'd been turned down by a lot of sales agents, and networks weren't interested. And we screened the film at this festival called Hot Docs in Canada, and at the end of the screening, a Netflix executive came, he started to speak, actually spoke to Joanna, our producer, and said, I really like the film, let's start a conversation. And thank God he did. And so we just worked, you know, they I think because they had global ambitions, they could see this working for them. And they were an incredible partner. And that, you know, I think Netflix is, for documentaries and subtitles, they're just very agnostic to it. And they're just, you know, if they feel the story's strong enough, it's irrelevant what language it's in, and subtitles and things that lots of networks would have been terrified of, you know, 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's really cool. So we mentioned it there. Let's move on to the White Helmets, and so this is a short documentary, and we'll go on to talk about this. But one of the things that I think is really great about your work is that I think you've really elevated the short documentary, which is sort of the bread and butter of what I do every day. So you know, you really reach cinematic heights with short docs and stop people patronising them, which I think is brilliant. So can we run the trailer for the White Helmets, please?
يلا ما تعزفين ماما مو ايوه
Missile attacks on hospitals and schools in rebel-held areas that left up to 50 civilians dead.
دفاع مدني صعب القبعة البيضاء اللي أول الناس بيكونوا موجودين حالة القصف. من سوريا الكل العالم عم بتتابع أخباره وعم ما حدا يلاقوا له حل. شعارنا أولاً وأخيراً نحن كدفاع مدني فمن أحياها فكأنما أحيا الناس جميعاً.
So this won the Oscar for Best Short Documentary, which is awesome. What were the origins of this one? Because I mean, it sort of it feels like it really stands as like one of the historical documents of the Syrian civil war. So how did you first come across this story? How did you get access?
So I've watched that in ages. I found it really emotional.
It brings it all back.
This began. My partner was working with an organisation called the Syria Campaign, who are this incredible organisation that still work to basically tell the story on the ground of civilians inside Syria. And so she told me, I'd learned about the White Helmets through her, and I remember saying distinctly, that's an incredible, they're incredible, that's an amazing story. And she said, well, HBO are making a big documentary about it. So I was like, okay, great, well, someone else is doing it, brilliant. Anyway, a year later, I remember saying to her, what happened to that HBO documentary? And she said, oh, it fell through for... I was like, oh, okay. So she connected us to the White Helmets eventually, via the Syria Campaign, and me and Joanna, who I made Virunga with, we flew out to Istanbul and we began where their leadership was based at the time, and we began a conversation with them, and said, look, we think what you're doing is extraordinary. It's this, the war in Syria is very complicated. The politics are really difficult. There was a lot of misinformation, but it felt like this was a story that it was just a really human story about normal people like all of us that decided to do, instead of fleeing or picking up a gun, which have obviously very difficult choices, both of them, but these guys just decided to rescue their neighbours when bombs fell. And eventually they said, films they take a lot of resource from organisations. They've got to, help us out. And, every day these guys are saving lives. So it was a big decision for them to work with anybody. But I think in the end they felt that there could be a benefit to it. And so eventually they said, yes, let's do it. And we'd planned originally to shoot in Aleppo, but the White Helmets actually said, please don't come. Because at this point there hadn't been any Western journalists there for about 6 months, because ISIS was active there and had kidnapped a load of people. And the White Helmet said, we can't protect you. The bombs is one thing, but we can't protect you from kidnap, and you might put us at risk too. And so at that point we said, okay, well, we can't do it. So we shot on the border in a training centre with the White Helmets, and we worked with one of they have sort of a team of people who document their rescues, and we worked with them, a young guy called Khalid Khatib, and trained him up he could film, but we trained him up in documentary filming techniques and basically sort of leaving the camera rolling for a long period. And the film was a collaboration between us and Khalid and two of his colleagues as well.
And I mean, some of the material is just absolutely stunning, and I think is a real testament to that, bravery that's far beyond anything I could do, and that sort of strand of you working with really heroic characters. I mean, calling them characters seems sort of patronising, but working with, and is that something that particularly interests you? Is kind of showing everyday heroism, I suppose.
I think if I at its most simple, Charlie, I think the world is really, if you turn on the news, it's very easy, I think, to become numb to everything because it's so depressing. There are so many enormous problems facing us all. And I need to be reminded of the good and the hope in people. And I think so I'm just drawn to stories where somebody is doing something incredible that makes me question my own life and what I do. And if I'm inspired by that, and I think, well, maybe other people might be. And that, I think that's normally the first thing that makes me interested in a particular story. And then, of course, if you dig in a bit more, and then it hopefully expands into a bigger, with layers and bigger story.
Yeah, great. And I mean, it's quite a basic question, but why was this a short and not a feature?
It is, and it definitely wasn't imagined originally as a short. It was imagined as a feature. It was features take years, and with the war in Syria, so at this particular moment, there was so much going on. It felt far too urgent to spend 2 or 3 years making a feature, And so Joanna and I, we just felt that we could do a short much more quickly. Because you can have less material and you can turn it around much faster. So that frankly is a simple reason why it was a short.
It's a good reason.
And I'm really glad it was in the end. And it was Netflix's first short, and they've gone on to make a lot more, which is great.
Yeah, and both with Virunga and this, you had a massive impact campaign around them, and some of the things you've done around impact campaigns have been really pioneering. But it felt particularly important with this one. It was a very, very important cause. So how did you approach the campaign around this?
Well, just I guess if anyone doesn't know, with a film about a social issue, if you believe the film can, because films take so long, I think we choose quite carefully the films that we make. You only have a certain number of them in you, and then. I remember when I started making films, I had a naive idea that if you make a film about something important and it goes on air, it will change the world, or it could change the world. And actually, it doesn't work like that at all. You need to work really hard with a film for it to have any chance of doing anything positive. And like you said, Virunga and White Helmets and a lot of our films, we've worked hard with them to try and do something positive with them. And in the case of Virunga, for instance, it was about using the film to try and get this oil company to do the right thing and leave. And Joanna, Natasagara, the producer, she actually runs an organisation called Violet Films, who they're brilliant at sort of impact strategy. And she actually really led on that and came up with a great strategy. And White Helmets, Joe worked on that too, but we also worked with the Syria campaign, who are already experts in this space.
Yeah, great. And sort of, I suppose along that impact campaign had the effect, and I suppose like the Oscar win brought you to the attention of, I suppose, certain forces out there who are less fond of the White Helmets. How was that experience of sort of having this misinformation campaign directed at you as, very clear allies of the White Helmets?
So the story in Syria that basically the Assad regime and Russia has wanted to pump out is that it's a binary choice between an elected government and everybody else is a terrorist, and that therefore it justifies how they can drop barrel bombs on civilian areas because everyone there is meant to be a terrorist. I mean, that's just, it's complete nonsense. This is the story they've pumped out. The White Helmets are really, they break that narrative. And so, the Assad regime and Russia media have tried very hard to discredit them, to say they're terrorists, they're actors. And there was an enormous amount of resource pumped into discrediting them. It was. I remember when we were doing the sort of the campaign around the film, I'd see friends post on Facebook that people would write to me and say, "Oh, yeah, but don't you know they're all actors? This is all lies." It's extraordinary. I remember there was an interview with him, and he was like, after the film won the Oscars, and he said, "Oh, they should have won the Oscar for Best Actor." That's, and I'd like to think that the film played, one thing it did do is play a role in showing some more of the reality of what's actually happening in Syria.
Yeah, well, and the sort of, that sort of reaction to it was so insane that, it just, I think, to me, it just seemed like it backfired on them. But anyway, let's move on to talk about Evelyn, which in a way is was a shift for you in the kind of documentaries you were making, and a very personal story. Can we run the trailer for Evelyn, please?
Yo, welcome. I'm Evelyn. This is a film about my family. What's that? Wow, wow. Wow, wow. Yeah, what's my little brother? Wicked. This is my sister. Here's Orlando, my older brother. God, I'm absolutely terrified to look at this.
I can't bring myself to talk about what happened to my brother and how he died.
I haven't even been able to say his name for like 10 years. None of us talked about it.
This walk will be a healing process.
We have a history of male suicide.
I can't fight the pit in my stomach every day that I know we're going to have this conversation.
He was saying, like, I'm going to kill myself, like, all the time.
Maybe I could have said something that would have meant he didn't do that.
It's the legacy of what happened and how all of our relationships have been fractured.
No, I'm sorry, I'm not chilling out.
Stop it.
If you don't open up completely, how are you going to feel later on?
Every day I'm questioning whether or not this whole thing is a good idea. His presence has such an influence.
I see Evelyn as a guardian. If I had to pray, it would be to that.
I don't feel that it's any less traumatic, but it does become a lot easier just to think about him.
That's good. I feel good.
Yeah, I mean, quite choked up when I see that trailer. So, you know, and I mean, I love this film. I told you at the time. So this, do you want to maybe just, I mean, maybe it's clear from the trailer, but do you want to just say what this film is about?
Sure. So I suppose as you guys saw, it's a film about my family. I had a brother who took his own life, and just none of us could talk about him. I mean, I couldn't say his name for 13 years. And well, I tell you how it came about. It was we'd launched the White Helmets at a film festival in the US, and I was sitting with Joanna, my producer, and I was pitching her ideas for the next film that we were going to make, and they were, you know, frankly, it was quite similar to White Helmets. It was a story of somewhere, you know, far away where something really bad was happening. And she said, just out of nowhere, she said, "Have you ever thought about making a film about your family?" And I remember going, "What?" And I was really surprised because I'd never even spoken to her about Evelyn. And I sort of, yeah, I probably knew she knew, but I was shocked that she'd asked. And I was furious even. I was like, "How dare you? How dare you even ask that?" And then I remember, well, there was two things. Firstly, how could I be angry? She just asked us. I can't be angry. That's not fair. That's a problem. And the weirdest bit of all was it was my brother's birthday on that day, and there's just no way she would have known that. Oh, wow. And it was sort of like, okay, well, maybe this is something I should think about. And I remember I basically I called my family a few weeks later, and I thought they're never going to want to do this. So frankly, this is a safe idea, but I'll say, are you interested in doing this? And what was really weird is all of them said yes, because I think everyone had sort of been waiting for an opportunity to talk. And I said, look, let's do, you know, would you be up for doing a walk? Because my family traditionally, the one time that we have been able to talk about difficult stuff is walking. And we went to all of the places that we'd been with Evelyn when he was alive. And we sort of walked across the country. And it was, you know, I don't say this lightly. It was life changing.
Yeah, yeah. And we get, I mean, you're so raw in the film, which I think is it's really hard for anyone to do that. But I think at this point you were a documentary director with, you know, a really good track record, like world known, and that must have been such a hard decision for you to expose yourself like this in a really unexpected way. I think for all of us watching.
Well, the reality is I hated it. I hated it for loads of it. I mean, frankly, just doing the walk was obviously very painful, but also being on camera and I remember like a few days in, I just thought this is a terrible idea. What are we doing? And it was very, very hard, and it sort of emotionally exhausting. And I didn't think it'd be a good film. Like there was loads of things about it that were very, very difficult. And I found it very hard to switch. I was still like, certainly the first few days I was very much in director mode, trying to control everything, you know, where the camera was. And I remember talking to Joanna about it, and she was like, what are you doing? Try and be in the moment. So it was very difficult, but it's probably the film I'm most proud of, actually.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you should be. I think it's incredible, and we, you know, we see that process through the film. I mean, people might not have seen it, so I don't want to, you know, reveal too much. But like, you're very sort of naked with your personal journey, with the kind of things you were saying there of not wanting to reveal much, and then, you know, something kind of triggers in you, and you do reveal a lot. And I think that's so brave. And were you worried that this would sort of affect people's perceptions of you? I don't know. Like,
I mean, short answer, yes. At the beginning, 100%. You know, we all like, you know, have an image that we project, right? And I've never been great at sharing any sort of emotion, really, and certainly not publicly. Definitely, you know, on social media, and like nothing like that. I never really shared much about my own life. So I was very worried, but actually, you know, in the end, that's just his ego, frankly. I found that, you know, one of the most extraordinary things in making this was when you are emotionally vulnerable with people, strangers or whatever, it's almost contagious. And in making the film, there were these moments, and I think they're the best moments in the film, where people would see the we'd be walking in the Lake District or wherever, and people would see the camera, and they'd be like, "Oh, what are you doing?" And I remember the first few interactions, I was too scared to really tell anybody, and we go, "Oh, we're just making a film, go away," and or you know, hope they'd go away. And as we got braver, it'd be like, "Okay, we're making a film about our brother who took his own life," and these moments where people would just freeze, and they'd suddenly share something. They'd say, "Okay, well, that actually happened to my mum," and you'd have these you know, you go from 0 to 100 miles an hour in seconds, and it was amazing. And we found that in screenings with the film, where we'd finish the film, and the audience became like these therapy sessions where everyone would just share, and that's very rare in normal life. And that's really lingered with me and stayed, and so I'd recommend that to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I was in the screening of it. I don't think you were there. I don't think there's a Q&A, but it really was that classic, I think, quite English thing, where I think we're really bad at sharing our emotions, but once a couple of people does it, like suddenly it kind of stimulates everyone to do it. And I sort of like it that this is such a, like, you know, English or British film. It starts out very repressed and then, you know, becomes something else. It's great. I'm really conscious of the time, so I think we might whiz through a couple of other films and maybe not show the clips. Let's move on to learning to skateboard in a war zone when you're a girl. I got it right, didn't I?
If you're a girl.
If you're a girl, sorry. Yeah, such a long title. So that also won an Oscar. And that, of course, kind of comes from Skateistan, your first start. So maybe you could talk about, I mean, the title explains it, but you could expand on that.
Well, so it's funny. I mean, to cut a long story short, I didn't direct Learning to Skateboard in the Warzone. It was directed by a brilliant New York filmmaker called Carol Dysinger, who has basically devoted her career to working in Afghanistan. But we began a conversation with an American network who'd learned about Skateistan, and the founder of the organisation had given a talk to them, and they were really inspired. And he'd said, you know, which was very sweet of him, he said, if you're interested in the film, I'm only really interested in working with Grain, because we had such a positive experience making that short 10 years ago. And so we loved that organisation. We've always tried to support them in any way we could. And so we worked with this network called A&E to make a longer film, but focusing this time on, whereas my original short was frankly just a real snapshot of the organisation. This was a slightly deeper dive into their class of a year following a number of their young female students. And so Carol went, I think she did about 4 or 5 trips out there and made this beautiful 40-minute film, which was released, I think, in 2019.
Yeah, I think so.
And I, it's a very, of course, I suppose in some ways it's a lot like a lot of our films. It's about something which at its heart's actually quite tragic, but it's full of hope, and it's basically about the ambitions and dreams of this class of young girls as they go through the year. And skateboarding is part of it, but really it's about their progression in confidence through the lessons of their teachers. And we were amazed that it won another Oscar.
Yeah, deservedly so. It's great. And so for that, so you were producing that one. You've had great success as a director and a producer. How do those things? Do you have a preference for either of those things? Like, was it quite nice to be stepping away and producing?
Do you know? No, I'm a director at heart. But what I suppose as I've got a bit older, and one thing I realised that I can do is I can help get funding for other people's projects. Funding's always a nightmare. Don't get me wrong. It's not easy to get anything, but if I can play that role on something else that we really believe in, and believe in the filmmaker and the story that they're trying to tell, that's incredibly rewarding. And so that's the capacity that I take on as a producer, basically.
Yeah, awesome. Let's move on to Convergence, which is out on Netflix at the moment. It's also brilliant. And I sort of, there've been a lot, it's about COVID all around the world, and there've been a lot of films about COVID, as you would expect, because it's dominated all of our lives. But I think this one's sort of distinguished by being this vast global view. So what were the origins of that one?
So this is I suppose my latest film, and it's very different in a lot of ways. I think I've generally worked on stories where we've found something that people don't really know about, and followed a very limited number of people, and then hope that elucidates something bigger about the world. And this is, in some ways, this is the opposite. This is like it follows 10 stories, and I mean the idea was to try and basically, cast your mind back April 2020. It's a very difficult time. COVID was spreading. Hundreds of thousands of people were getting sick. Governments were using the pandemic to crack down on freedoms, and so it was very worrying. And then at the same time, if I looked out on my street as a Londoner where no one talks to each other, my neighbours were helping each other out. People were cooking for more vulnerable members of my community, doing shopping, and social media was full of these examples of people doing these amazing altruistic acts. And so it felt there was an opportunity to try and tell a story about people around the world responding, but in a positive way. And we sort of sent out, notes to film festivals and filmmaker networks saying, look, we're trying to put together this film, this team. Who is anyone interested in telling stories from their communities? And we built this kind of global collaboration with incredible filmmakers all around the world, who were telling stories from their communities. And that's the heart of that's how the film began anyway.
Yeah, and so you ended up with multiple co-directors, because obviously you were, you couldn't travel to a whole load of different places. And how was that experience of working with people all around the world?
It was, I think at the beginning I was very nervous. I didn't really think it would work. It's actually probably one of the things, I guess one of the biggest takeaways for me as a filmmaker is, I think historically, if we're making a film, I think most filmmakers, if you're making a film somewhere, let's say in Indonesia, we'd basically take an entire crew with us and work, maybe a local producer. But I probably would never do that again. I think there's so many incredible, talented people everywhere. There are documentary communities which exist in places I didn't really think documentary had a community. And I was amazed at the talent, frankly. And I mean, this film, the collaboration is ultimately what was the strength of it.
Yeah. And allows us to see a view of COVID as a global phenomenon, which is something that I think we really need when we've all been stuck in one place for so long.
Yeah, I mean, I think we tried to we tried to make a film that, yes, of course, it was set in a pandemic. We tried to make a film that wasn't really about COVID in the end. The film begins with everybody responding to the crisis, but what everybody ends up responding to, or most of the characters respond to, is the flaws in society that COVID has exposed. Government failure, civil society rising up to plug the holes. I think that's one of the patterns that we've seen around the world over the last 18 months.
Yeah. Let's see if there's any questions out there in the audience. I'm hoping we've got a microphone out there, but if we haven't, you can just shout. Oh yeah, we've got a microphone here. Does yeah, great. Thank you for putting the lights up. Do we have any questions out there? Orlando? Cool.
Very short question. I was just interested to know if you have anything in the planning at the moment or any ideas that inspire you currently.
Well, there's loads that inspires me. I'm making a series with Netflix at the moment about the Invictus Games, which is fascinating. And we're just about to release a film about the restoration movement that's also I love. And they're probably the only ones I can talk about.
Are you able to say something a bit more about the new film?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So this is a film. It's called From Devil's Breath, and it's about and frankly it's about climate change really and the biodiversity crisis. But it follows a story in Portugal of this horrendous fire which killed a lot of people, and then efforts of the community to basically replant indigenous trees to prevent a fire like this happening. But also it follows a scientist this guy called Professor Crowther, who he counted the number, it's extraordinary, he counted the number of trees there are. It was a few years ago, you'd have thought someone had counted the number of trees there were on Earth, and no one had, and he counted the number of trees, and it turns out there's 3 trillion trees on this planet. And then him and his team thought, well, how much room is there to either plant new trees or allow new trees to restore? And they worked out that there was room for 1 trillion new trees, mostly in areas which human beings have cut down trees already. And then they worked out how much carbon would be absorbed if those trees grew to maturity. And it's extraordinary. It would take out 1/3 of man-made carbon in the atmosphere. So it's a sort of extraordinary discovery of how important restoration, rewilding, and protection of biodiversity can be in the fight against the climate emergency. And the film tells those 2 stories.
Amazing. And when is this coming out? How can people see it?
God, I don't even know. No, I think early next year.
Okay, great. That's good. Do we have more questions? Yep, got a couple springing up.
I've been filming a local community for 3 years, and part of that, COVID happened, and then there's some incredible women that sort of stepped up to feed the community. And so part of that, I had obviously permission before, I had to kind of film people collecting their food packages. And I could see that even though they'd given me permission, there was almost like an element of shame or them putting the shopping in quicker. And you come across as having a high level of empathy. I wondered if you've encountered that while making films and how you kind of worked with not feeling like you're exploiting them, but having those uncomfortable situations that you kind of have to film, but you as a person feel conflict.
It's a really good question. I mean, the answer is yes, of course. You know, there's been many times where you're filming and you feel uncomfortable about what you're filming. I think filmmaking inherently is an extractive process in some ways. I think what you have to do as a filmmaker, we all have to do as a filmmaking community, you have to try and lessen the extractive nature as much as possible and make films which are not extractive. And there's loads of always as least extractive as possible. And there's lots of ways of doing that. I mean, you know, firstly, like a key thing is doing things really slowly. I think news crews, it's very difficult for them to do it. They sort of parachute in very quickly have to get a story and then leave again. And that, I think, for a lot of people that are, you know, let's say in a vulnerable situation, that can feel very exploitative in some ways. Documentary doesn't have to be like that. You know, of course there's challenges with budget and all this other stuff, but one of the great things is certainly about long form documentaries, you can do things slowly and you can work long term with communities, and all the people in your film, if you do it right, the people in front of the camera should feel like they're part of the filmmaking team in some ways. And it's also, it's about talking to people, it's about listening, it's about not going in with a set idea of what a story might be and being open to change and working collaboratively, running an impact campaign if the film has social issues at its heart, so that actually there is something to give back to people when the film comes out. I mean, there's loads of resources about this stuff online. Lots of people have written brilliantly about it. So yeah, I mean, it's a long answer, but I've touched on it a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, we've got another one over here.
Hi. I wondered, I've been feeling rather guilty about, you know, the fact that I've got a story in the US, right? You know, that will mean a lot of flying around. And with COP24 and everything, I'm trying to think about the ways that we can, as documentarians, make films without destroying the planet, right? And, you know, we can't be stuck entirely on archive. And I wonder what thoughts you might have about that.
That's a fantastic question, and you know, it's actually something which isn't spoken about that much. Like making films it does have a significant impact on the environment. You know, there's a lot of travel involved and you know, drama even much more because crews are much bigger and there's, you know, enormous amounts of flying around. But it is a big thing. I mean, I think one of the things, you know, going back to Convergence is just actually is working with local teams to document things. When, as you know, this film was basically made. I did a little bit of traveling, but very, very little, and it was amazing just how much could be done by co-directors or local teams filming things. So I'm hoping that will be a bigger legacy, not of our film, but of the pandemic as a whole, because people can work like that. But I mean, you know, the short answer is it's a problem, and I don't think it's really spoken enough about in the documentary field.
No, I feel like the documentary industry has been very slow to come to terms with it, and there's been quite a lot of shame around it. And yeah, it's something we should talk more about. I'm always surprised how little is spoken. I think we can probably fit in like one more. Yeah, there's a lady down the front here. Where's the microphone? Oh, yeah, okay, let's take both of them. Yeah.
So for the COVID documentary, how did you get the access of the WHO in terms of those internal meetings?
Oh, how do we get access to the WHO?
Yes, yeah, I was wondering that.
So, I mean, well, so the access question is always hard, but the answer generally is the same. It's writing, you know, and in the first instance, writing an email that's just very transparent about what you're trying to do, that's honest and realistic. I think that's always a first port of call. Generally, that email never gets answered, so you then just have to keep following it up. Persistence really does often lead to a result. I think when I think about most of the hard-won access that we've had as a company, it's basically from following up a lot until somebody says, okay, God, I really have to answer these guys. And then at least you start a dialogue. You know, and frankly, that was the case with the WHO. I wrote a long email addressed to Dr. Tedros, but not sent to his email address. And eventually, I think they believed in what the story we were trying to tell, a global story, a story which, frankly, was, you know, a love letter to people in a time when was so much upsetting stuff about what was happening, and yeah, they eventually said, okay, fine, come and film for a bit.
Amazing. All right, we'll just take one more. This will be our last one. Yeah, you. Yes, thank you for being patient.
I mean, the simple answer is you turn down films all the time, and just because there just isn't enough. There isn't enough time, frankly. And I mean, obviously, if it's something if someone wrote to me and said we really like to make this film, and I really, really believed in it, but there was too many other things going on. I guess, you know, you try and say, well, maybe we could do it later. But mostly that doesn't happen. There's a story that's urgent, and you just have to say, I'm sorry, we can't do that. But yes, I mean, and that's, I suppose, as you get more well known, that sort of thing happens more and more often. But there's plenty of other brilliant filmmakers. So if somebody's throwing money and saying we've got a project and it's all funded, if I can't do it, great, someone else could do it.
Are there things you've not done that you sort of look back on and go, oh man, like I'm so sad I couldn't do that? You don't need to say what they were, but yeah.
Yeah, always, especially when it's super successful.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes, I've definitely,
the reality
had that. That's the reality.
The business. Yeah. We're out of time, sadly. This was really great. I hope everyone got a lot from this. Do check out all of Orlando's films. Many of them are on Netflix, so they're accessible to those of us with subscriptions. But yeah, check them all out. And thank you so much for coming to Folkestone, Orlando.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Charlie.
Okay, we need to